Good.
Good boy. All right, take a minute, dive in with your partner. All right, what is the biggest, most obvious, broad historical development that we can tie this to? And what point is this cartoon trying to argue? 1 minute, chat it out, go for it, guys. What's the biggest, most obvious Cold War, tension between Soviet.
We did this last class.
What's bigger context? Broader. Yeah. What? Right, we're looking like
The historical context for this particular cartoon is like Truman Doctrine, when he said that communism is a threat. We need to help any small communism. So they promised like kind of good money, like $4 billion. I know, and then the point of view of something like it's anti-Suburban
America. I hear good things. I see good things. I believe good things. Nicely done. Nicely done. What is the most obvious, broad historical context we can tie this cartoon to, Eliam? Cold War, yeah. So like, if you're thinking broadly speaking, right, context you want to paint with a broad brush, the Cold War, right? These new debates about the U.S.'s role in the world, these new questions about what we're supposed to do to guarantee the freedom of democracy. Absolutely, absolutely. And then go ahead for me, please, Rubio. What is the point of view of this cartoon? What does the cartoon think about these new policies the U.S. is pursuing?
Well, something I kind of discussed was that it's anti-giving aid to places like Europe.
Good.
It's pretty much demonstrating that America or the U.S. is blindly walking and trying to give aid, and it's going against our original foreign policy, which is to stay out of any foreign affairs.
I see you. I see you. Right? We can reference Washington's farewell address. We can reference the Monroe Doctrine. Absolutely. Right. We can even reference, if we wanted to, the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which at least makes us more of a police force, but does so only in the Western Hemisphere. Right? What foreign policy is this most similar to in America's history? Dollar diplomacy, right? Taft-esque, of just investing a bunch of money in other countries, right? Railroads in China. U.S. investment in Central America fruit farms, for example. Cool. Nicely done. Yeah, it's anti, right? Then it looks like eventually the U.S. is going to do what? Yeah, you're fall in the ocean. Here we are, the new American foreign policy. This new foreign policy, what's one word we can use for this new foreign policy? One word. Containment. Yeah. Right? Sometimes you guys overthink it. Yeah, quarantine, sure. But it's instead of containing communism where it is and where it exists. Good. Nicely done, guys. So before I start, don't forget our third to last boot camp is on Saturday. Our third to final boot camp is on Saturday. As of Sunday, you have exactly 2 months until the test. Oh my God. Yeah, as of Sunday, you are 2 months out. In 4 months, you will have your test scores. So if that's motivation for whether or not you want to get out of bed, Santos, on Saturday morning and come hang out with us, I would use the fact that it's 1 day shy of the 2-month warning as motivation. Saturday we'll go, I'm going to try to do more of a comprehensive review of some old stuff, right? So we're not letting too much old stuff fall through the cracks. So Saturday, just to make sure I have enough donuts and juice, because I don't want to ever be short donuts and juice. We always have enough juice. Quick show of hands, who's coming on Saturday? Nice. Santos, if you don't come on Saturday, bro, I will go and park my car outside your house and literally sit on the horn until you come outside. Or I get shot, whatever happens first. Real quick, hands back up so I can count for donuts. Good. 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 13, 14. All right, cool. So we'll be about 17 or so of you. Come. All right? I'm starting at 8 o'clock. Get here on time. Let's get cracking.
11 or 11:30?
We'll finish at 11 this time. All right, I think last time was good to have the hard 3 hours because the last half hour kind of goes off the rails. Yes, ma'am. Yes. Or I can just give you the materials. Or both. Sure. For you? Yeah, exactly. Just skip your internship. Obviously, A-push is more important than the rest of life. Just show up.
Low-key?
Okay, it is what it is. High key. Now, so, Saturday. We only have a couple more Saturday boot camps available, and one of them is earmarked for a full-length practice test. So in terms of like real opportunities to review, there's not much left. All right, so if you're going to come Saturday, I'm going to hold you accountable to what you're here to do. We'll take care of our business. We'll get through a lot of good stuff. The last couple Saturdays have been really productive and good. I want to make sure that this coming Saturday is our most productive yet. So we'll take care of our business and make sure that it's worth our time. Okay? It's in 2 days. Yeah. Yeah. Luis is over here reorganizing his backpack because that's more important. Trying to find something, that's why. Good. I don't have any other announcements except keep in mind what I stressed to you guys the other day on Monday, that in period 8, like, reading is going to be your best friend. Reading is going to be your best friend. Today we'll talk about the 1950s. Very, very important time in American history. Monday and Wednesday, we'll talk civil rights movement. It's kind of a standalone thing within. So I know a lot of your reading was on the civil rights movement. I'm not going to touch on that today, but I'll circle back and hit all the civil rights movement on Monday and Wednesday. The following week, we hit the Great Society of LBJ and the Vietnam War. Then we get into the 70s and what happens in the 70s and kind of this questioning of the role of the governments. How much should we trust the government? First time in American history where more Americans distrust the government than trust the government. And then we get into Ronald Reagan's 80s and then we're done. So we are very close to done. Stay on your A game. Don't let anything fall through your cracks. And don't forget today, it's Thursday. I'll be here after school. And starting today, every Thursday, I'm going to start picking periods. Not at random, but with some strategy involved, picking periods. So we're going to focus our review first on whatever like today questions there were that need to be clarified, and then diving into a period 3 and 4 review. Yeah, a 3 and 4 discussion of the need to know stuff on periods 3 and 4. Cool. So that way we keep ourselves focused and maximize our time. Now, today we'll talk. I told you on Monday that for the most part we will discuss period 8 through the lens of who's president and what they do domestically and foreign policy wise during their presidencies. Today I have on the title Eisenhower and Kennedy. So we're gonna eight years of Ike and about 2.5 years of JFK before he is retired quickly by an assassin's bullet or two. But today the real theme of the 50s is economic prosperity. All right, the 50s are going to be a very successful economic time in American history. We'll talk in the 50s about the good old days. Oftentimes when you hear an old white person talking about the good old days, it's the 1950s they think they're referring to. They don't know what they're referring to, but in general, it's what they think they're referring to. But this prosperity, like all times in American history, this prosperity will take place amidst a period of global upheaval in which the world is coming to some increasing tensions and also some domestic upheaval. Now, some of the domestic upheaval you guys read about, right? The growth, the birth, the seeds of the civil rights movement. We're starting to see African Americans organize in a way that will be revolutionary by the 1960s. But for the most part, in the 1950s, we're going to see a very 1920s-esque society. Very good comparison decade is the 1920s. In that people are enjoying themselves, people have money, except this decade, the 50s does not end in a Great Depression. So, such is life. Your prompt is here. Daniel, read first, please, sir.
Me?
Yeah. Are you Daniel?
I think so. To validate the extent to which the 1950s domestic and foreign policies demonstrated both continuity and change in American society.
Cool. So how much are the 1950s policies, domestic and foreign-wise, going to show change and continuity in our society? Key concepts are here, and your outline is here. It's on the board as well. It's on your notes as well. We'll talk about Eisenhower's policies. Eisenhower is our one Republican president in a sea of Democrats, right? After our 1920s Republican experience, which obviously ended so well. of Harding and then Coolidge and then Hoover. Pro-business, 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 cut tax, cut tax, cut tax. Oh, what do you mean the money ran out? We go, obviously, FDR. Truman, Eisenhower. He gets 2 terms. And then we go JFK. I'll teach the class. You sit there and go and listen. And then we go JFK, LBJ, and then we finally come back with Nixon, who also will not finish his time as president because he quits instead of going to jail. But we'll get there next week, 2 weeks. So moral of the story, from 1928 to 1968, we have 2 Republican presidents elected. The first is Hoover, doesn't end very well. The second and last of those is Eisenhower. We'll talk about 1950s domestic prosperity, or this happiness that looks all nice and happy on the surface in the 1950s. But we will talk about the other Americas. There's an important book that there was a short excerpt of in your homework. You'll also read a chunk of today called The Other America by Michael Harrington, which will be a nice comparison to what happens in the 1920s, but also what happens in the Gilded Age, which I would argue is a comparison for today. Right? It doesn't matter how rich America is, there is this underbelly of America that is really struggling with poverty, no matter what things look like on the top. And then we'll end, if time permits, we'll see. Ideally, if we're on top of our A game, we'll end with Kennedy's America. And we'll talk briefly about Kennedy's domestic policy, they called the New Frontier, and we'll talk about his Cold War, which kind of bubbles up and boils up to a couple different hot positions, like the Berlin Wall, like the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs, and what will eventually become Vietnam. So the 50s are a fascinating time of change, a time of that people look back longingly at. But those are the good old days, and we'll try to figure out why. So real quick, I'm going to make sure that from Monday's policies, we're good on Truman. We're good on Truman. He promised that idea of a fair deal. Right, that's what his domestic policy is called, right? Modeling off of what he saw with Teddy Roosevelt and his square deal from the early 1900s, from FDR and his New Deal. His goal with the fair deal was to continue pushing the government to guarantee more and more progress for society. Now, question for you guys. Why was much of his fair deal legislation stopped? Who was keeping Truman from pushing for the kinds of policies he wanted to pursue? Not the Supreme Court.
Congress?
What about Congress? Republicans and these Southern Democrats. Right? The Dixiecrats, this Southern wave of Democrats that's against big government, against progress, largely against government spending, but also against civil rights. So his fair deal was his goal. As we talked about it on Monday, it's just that it really matters. The Taft-Hartley Act is a very important piece of legislation that cancels the Wagner Act. That really limits the power for labor unions. It creates this idea of right-to-work states, or states that basically don't create policies that give labor unions any real credibility or argumentative power. So the Taft-Hartley Act is very important in the context of labor growth. Right? Labor unions finally got that Wagner Act, that Magna Carta for labor, and then within 10, 12 years, it's gone. But very importantly, under Truman's presidency, domestically, we need to give him credit for 2 very important executive orders, 9980 and 9981, ordered by the president in 1948, both desegregating the federal government, the first one, and desegregating the U.S. military. Now, who's the president who resegregated the federal government? Why is our federal government segregated? Who's the president that did that? Wilson. Right? Wilson was that president that I told you you'll like him because of these ideas like the 14th Amendment and world peace and all these things. But then he's the one who, of course, shows Birth of a Nation at the White House and adds this new segregated federal government policy. Of course, the federal government had been desegregated since Reconstruction, but it's under Truman's presidency that we see the desegregation of the federal government. And the military, right? 2 very important things. 2 very, very important things. So I would argue that his fair deal is moderately successful, right? He raises the minimum wage, to a small extent, extends Social Security privileges, but in terms of labor unions, sucks for them, with another big success being on this idea of really starting the civil rights push. How about his containment policies? What do you guys think? Successful to a large, moderate, or small extent? What do you guys think? I would say at least moderate, if not large. Right? He gets a hard time for quote-unquote losing China. Right? But I don't know if China was ever his to keep in the first place. But we do keep communism contained in Korea. We keep communism contained in Europe. Right? The Marshall Plan works. The Truman Doctrine works. The Korean War, quote-unquote, works. The Marshall Plan is incredibly successful to rebuild Western Europe in this model of capitalism. The Truman Doctrine, despite, of course, being seen as an act of aggression by the Soviets, is important because it provides this framework, right? This idea that it's like taking Dayquil when you're starting to get sick. That you can do something to stop what's oncoming if what's oncoming is communism. That using military resources, economic resources for countries that are actively fighting against the spread of communism, specifically Greece and Turkey. Also monumentally important to his foreign policy is that National Security Act, which ramps up our military preparedness, the creation of the Department of Defense, the creation of the National Security Council, the creation of the CIA. So getting ready, obviously, here to fight a new kind of war. We talked yesterday in class about whether or not it was Truman's fault. And we added a bunch of evidence that said, like, it really was Truman. They were ramped up. Now, we could argue all day about, was he ramping up his readiness in response to a communist threat or in advance of a communist threat? That's open to interpretation. But it's very clear from everything here down, the U.S. is preparing to fight a very different type of war. A war that requires preparations that aren't just standard military, have a big army and a lot of tanks type of war. And NSC 68, I saw it in Chavez Do Now, I was happy, is very important in its justification of federal government military spending. You can make an argument that one of the reasons we don't go back into a recession after World War II is military spending. We looked at Keynesian economics of the military, the government just spending a lot of money. Instead of spending money on social programs like the New Deal, we're going to shift all that spending to military preparedness. So the government is still spending trillions of dollars a year, but instead of on things like the Works Progress Administration and the Civilian Conservation Corps, we're spending that money on atomic weapons. Now, you think that's good or bad, but then you're paying somebody to build it, you're paying somebody to manufacture it, you're paying somebody to transport it. So it does keep people employed. But NSC 68, I can't stress this to you guys enough, is really this foundation of, in the Cold War specifically, an enemy of communism is my friend. We don't care if you are a terrible leader. We don't care if you are a terrible person. We don't care if your people in your country hate you. If you, in your nation's leadership, are opposing communism, we'll give you money. That's it. We'll support you. We'll prop you up. We'll overthrow your competition. We'll kill your rivals. All right, we'll use this and this and this and whatever it takes, because not just an enemy of my enemies, my friend, an enemy of communism will be our friend. And this is going to lead the U.S. down a very dangerous road. Right? In places like Iran, in places like Guatemala, all over Latin America, other places in the Middle East, of supporting, in South Vietnam, of supporting terrible administrations. Terrible people, terrible governments. But doing so because they're opposing communism. So that's one of the legacies of this Truman presidency as well. So let's talk Eisenhower. I like Ike. That's his campaign platform in 1952. That's it. Right? And everyone's like, yeah, that's a good plan. That's a good campaign strategy. I like Ike too. I always reference my campaign mug because it's fun. It makes me happy. There it is. I like Ike. And that's it. I like Ike. All right. There's FDR for a New Deal. Win with Wilson. Hoover. There you go. Next comes A Time for Greatness. Kennedy for president. Best president ever. He didn't finish one term, bro. So, everyone likes to rank Kennedy as one of the best presidents ever because he's a good-looking dude, right? Like, I mean, in order to be considered one of the best presidents ever, I would hope you at least finish 4 years. Not that it was his fault. I mean, I guess he could have ducked. But, so,
Can work.
Eisenhower is elected. Wear a bike helmet. Eisenhower is elected in 1952, and he's elected for a couple reasons. Right? Keep in mind, and I'll put this up here. Eisenhower is from what political party? Republican. Yeah, so he's a Republican, and usually when people are unhappy with the status quo, they vote to the other party. Right? We've seen it happen all over the place in American history. In this case, it's two frustrations that get him elected. The first is the Red Scare. People really believe, at this time, they're really believing that communists are infiltrating America. They're coming for us. They're coming for us here at home, in our own government. And they look at Eisenhower as a big, strong, powerful leader, and he can put them down. He'll stop this communist threat. Now, Eisenhower has no political history, no political experience. His only real experience is he's a war hero from World War II. And it always works out so well when we elect war heroes. Andrew Jackson was a war hero. Tippy Canoe was a war hero. Grant was a war hero. It always works out so. Wait a second. And Roosevelt was definitely not. Oh, FDR was he in the wheelchair wars? Yeah. Teddy Roosevelt was a war hero, absolutely. Right? FDR was good at wheelchair basketball. So we're frustrated with the Red Scare, and we're frustrated that we're stuck in Korea. Right? We're not winning Korea, we're not losing Korea, we're just there in Korea. So these two frustrations that give Eisenhower our first Republican presidency since Hoover. Since Hoover, of course, he's a World War II hero. Right? And we can look at his presidency as the antidote, as the medicine for what's called K1C2. The Korean War, communism, and corruption. And he's there to clean up the government, to clean up communism, to fix the Korean War, to get the U.S. out of there, and to provide a really strong, aggressive leader against communism. His vice president, fun fact, is Richard Nixon, a name that will play a vital role in the rest of our course, really. A man whose name is being mentioned more these days in comparison to our current president. Whether you agree or disagree with the comparison is being bandied about in terms of presidents who are accused of a lot of things and use the witch hunt defense. And then, a lot of other things come out, so keep this in mind. And Nixon is seen as a very strong anti-communist, a hawk on communism. And Nixon, this is going to be fun later, I want you to remember this. Nixon's big thing as vice president, he's very anti-corruption. He's there to clean up the government. He's there to hold people accountable for their actions, which is hilarious when he resigns as president because he's about to be indicted and put in jail for corruption. Now, it's always the people that complain the most about something that is usually guilty of that themselves. Right? Those that are always saying, I'm not a racist. Nobody asked. So, this is the Wendy's drive-thru. Now, Eisenhower's big promise is, I'm going to go to Korea. And of course, everyone's like, he's a war hero. He'll go right to Korea and end that war and fix that problem. And he's elected pretty overwhelmingly. It's a nice, strong election for the Republicans. He does go to Korea. One of his first actions as president is follow through to go to Korea. He overturns the United Nations battle plan of this stalemate that's taking place. He threatens to drop a nuclear bomb on China. China's like, damn, this fool's wild as hell. And he gets an armistice, which is like a peace without an agreement, right? An end to fighting, an end to conflict. The armistice is signed in Korea in 1953. So his first action as president is to go to Korea, start blustering about how he's going to kill everybody with these atomic bombs. It's 1953, people believe him. And we don't end, but we resolve the Korean War in 1953, thus putting an end to our first Cold War hot conflict. Cool! What was resolved in Korea? Nothing, but we stopped fighting, right? The communists don't get to expand, the U.S. doesn't lose any more lives, and the forgotten war is over and could be forgotten again. So I'm going to spend the first part of today talking about Eisenhower's domestic policies. Though. We title his domestic plan Modern Republicanism. This is an important term, modern republicanism. Because we look at Republicans today as being what side of the political spectrum? The left is liberal. Right. Yeah, right, very conservative. Right? So we look at Republicans today, and this current administration is a bad example, because this is not even conservatism, it's much more Trumpism. But conservatism is supposed to be about conservative socially and conservative fiscally. Who knows what fiscally means? Yeah, economically with money. So Republicans in general want to have small governments, conservative governments, very much like what you should have been writing about in your SAQ on period 7 about Warren G. Harding. Pro-business, not using the government for social progress, not using the government to spend a bunch of money to prop people up. So really the anti-FDR. That's conservatism. But Eisenhower is going to argue that he's more of a modern conservative. He wants to be conservative fiscally. Right? The government shouldn't spend a bunch of money. But he believes more in social progress, according to him. Right? He believes in conservative government spending. He believes in a balanced budget. Something we haven't really been doing much of. Right? We look at the New Deal and FDR, just spend, spend, spend. He's much more so on less spending, more balance economically. But he doesn't want to end New Deal programs. Because by now, New Deal programs are very popular. Programs like Social Security are very popular. Because now people are retired and realizing it's kind of nice to have a check once a month. So he doesn't want to necessarily end New Deal programs, but he doesn't want to keep expanding the size of the government. He doesn't want to keep expanding it. And he also believes in this modern republicanism in a strong, I'll put this on here as well. So for him, Republican, he's going to be economically or fiscally conservative, but much more socially, I would call it moderate. And foreign policy, aggressive. He recognizes what Truman, it's very important for the whole Cold War, all of period A. It's really going to bite LBJ in the ass. He realizes that in order to do what you want at home, in order to get done what you want on domestic policies, you need to be strong on communism. You need to be strong on foreign policy. Because he realizes what happened to Truman when Truman lost China. It killed his credibility at home. So he realizes, this is one of the themes of period 8, more than any other time in American history, that what you do foreign policy-wise impacts your credibility at home. That if you are seen as weak on communism, they won't let you do anything on home stuff. If you are seen as soft in the Cold War, then Congress and the American public won't let you get what you want done domestically. Does that make any sense? So it's the first time in American history where foreign policy becomes like this pawn or this chip to play. So we see with Eisenhower that he realizes that the affluence, the richness, the post-war good life at home was fully dependent on being strong on communism overseas. This is his quote. He says, "I'm conservative when it comes to money. Economically conservative. But I'm liberal when it comes to human beings." It's an interesting perspective. So he wants to be, and I wouldn't give him credit to being a social liberal, he's much more of a social moderate. But he's not conservative. So he's realizing that on money stuff, he doesn't want to tax the hell out of people and spend the hell out of government money. A more balanced approach economically, but socially liberal. Stuff that helps people, he's okay with. Which you could argue today is the antithesis of what Republicans are arguing for today. Which is economically and socially conservative. So, kind of the antithesis of Republicanism today. So, 8 years as president, what he accomplishes domestically, we give him some really important stuff. We'll call it a modest domestic record. He does not end New Deal programs like you would assume a Republican would in the 1950s. He does, however, add to Social Security and add to the minimum wage, which is good. That's good. He expands on FDR's Federal Housing Administration. That's important. He helps suburbia, home building in suburbia, a tunnel, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And under him, we see the creation of the Health Department, still a department of the government today, the Education Department, and the Welfare Department. So he does expand the reach of the federal government to a moderate extent. What's nice is during his presidency, we see the U.S. economy avoiding some of our concerns about post-war inflation. The economy stays on a nice steady growth. It doesn't go too up, too far down. We don't see too much inflation like we're worried about from post-war spending. And middle-class prosperity hits more Americans in the 1950s than ever before. Our middle class, our nice, comfortable, not rich, not poor, in between America, that class of America gets as big as ever before in the 1950s. So that's good. Domestically, that's exciting. Now, you can make an argument that his most important domestic impact is the interstate highway system. How many of you have ever driven on a freeway in your life? Not driven, because I hope none of you are, I wouldn't trust any of you to drive with people. Bro, you can't even see over the steering wheel. Those things are heavy. I know, right? High heels. So, you guys have all been on a freeway in your life? Yeah, I hope so. You thank Eisenhower. Thank Eisenhower. Under him, we passed the Highway Act of 1956, which creates 41,000 miles of highway in the United States to further connect our major cities. What have we done with the world? Yeah, we made the world smaller. Good, good. So city to city, we are more interconnecting our country, especially given, this is a nice comparison into the 20s, because what's our big purchase in the 20s? What's our big purchase in the 20s? Cars, right? So that, now Americans are really car dependent, and now we have a way to use these cars to really shrink the world. I'll tell you how I told you that the Puritans, the New England colony, invented the grandparent. Yes? Remember that back in the day? We were living longer and happier. Eisenhower invented the road trip. Yeah, Eisenhower's presidency invented the road trip. Right? So then the middle class America that we just talked about being a much bigger class are now taking road trips. Right? Getting in their station wagons, driving city to city, seeing the world that way, in a way we've never seen before up to this point. Now, there's a kind of a fun aside to this conversation about this National Highway Act. It's much more done for national defense reasons. Right? Yeah, it's done to facilitate travel, that's cool, to shrink the world, that's cool. But it's much more done because of the Cold War, so we can get our missiles around, so we can get our tanks, if needed, around, mostly missiles, though, our missile systems that are being built to be able to be transported with trucks and tanks and the like. For example, why is every freeway overpass so high? When you drive on a freeway, and like the roads above it are at least like 14 feet tall. We don't have 14-foot tall cars in that time. It's done so we can transport missile systems around the country in a way that can then use the added infrastructure in the United States. Think about that next time you're on the freeway.
I thought it was for trailers though.
Were there trailers then?
Yeah, now they say that.
Exactly. So now that's why it's there. So, but these highways have a huge domino effect, right? These highways, and not like a communism domino effect, but like a societal domino effect. Of course, they're going to promote national defense, but they're also going to be great for interstate trade, for making our economy more interconnected. They're going to be great for vacation travel. They're going to be great for advertising, for billboards, for car sales, for tire sales. It's not just a highway, but everything else that comes with it. Gas stations, motels, right? Little towns that are popping up along highways like they used to pop up along railroads in the Gilded Age. Now, the good part here, though, this is what makes him a economic conservative, is he's not paying for these highways, the government's not paying for these highways with more taxes on people. They are paying for it with taxes, but not like income taxes. Normally when the government has to have a big project, it comes out of our income taxes. He's being economically conservative by saying it's not the general tax money that will pay for these programs, but every time you buy gas, you'll pay part of a highway tax. Every time you buy tires, you'll pay part of a highway tax. Anytime you buy a car, you'll pay part of a highway tax. So question for you guys. Think about this for a second. Who was really paying for these highways? Be more specific.
The car industry?
No? The people that use them.
Cardinals?
The people paying for the highways are the people that will use the highways. You see what I'm saying? So if you don't have a car, you're not paying for this highway. You're not using this highway. So this is an example of a good economic conservative view where you're not raising taxes on everybody. You're taking the people that are using this resource, they're paying the taxes and it's being applied just to their resource. So it's not even necessarily an expanded government spending because the money's coming in and going right back out for what that money is for. Here's a picture of the highways that are laid by the Interstate Highway Act of the 1950s. What does it look a lot like? Yeah, look at the railroad maps. Right? There's more in the Northeast connecting the Midwest, less in the South, and less in the West. But, for example, today, the 10 freeway is right here, right just south of downtown. I'm sure you can take it out to, I don't know, Pomona, San Bernardino. Anybody ever driven that way? Yeah, probably. There's the 10 freeway. Yeah, the 5 is, there's the 5. The 5 goes right here, all the way to Seattle. To this day, you can get on the 5 freeway and drive right to Seattle. Here's the 10 freeway. I grew up on the 10 freeway. The 10 freeway is right here. you can get on the 10 freeway as of the 1950s, as of 2019, and not leave the 10 freeway until you get to Jacksonville, Florida. No, you might pass like 6 different Jacksonville, Mississippis. So, because they live in Stonewall Jackson, Confederate general. Now, as you see, this interconnects the world. Anytime we have more infrastructure, what does that lead to? Anytime we have more infrastructure. Migration. Thank you. Phenomenal answer. Anytime people can migrate, they do. Right? Why do people move west after the War of 1812? Because there's more roads, more canals, more interconnectivity. Why do people? So what's going to lead here is a ton of migration as well. And this is part of the option SAQ from last year, comparing migrations. Yep, and this is the growth of what we'll refer to as the Sun Belt. So remember I told you this used to be called the Iron Belt or the Steel Belt? Yeah. Here, yes. Now it's called the Rust Belt. Because what happens when you leave iron for a long time? It gets rusty. So all these states that are in blue are going to have a growth rate less than the national average. So they're growing slower than the rest of the country. So all these states are growing significantly slower. And of course, Pennsylvania low, Ohio low, West Virginia is actually losing people, Kentucky low. All these old iron and steel producers, we're not producing as much iron or steel anymore, and people are moving to what becomes known as, well, the South becomes a more populous place, and the Sun Belt becomes a more populous place. Yeah, but Alaska goes from like 8 people to 17 people. So we're really excited about Alaska, right? Soon they're going to outnumber the polar bears. Now, soon. What does this tell us, though, about society in the 1950s and 60s? What can we take a minute, talk to your partner, what can we learn about this population map of the United States post-World War II? Take a minute and talk about it. Why? Why? What can we gather about society in the 1950s? What's up? Yeah. Look at California, look at Nevada, look at Arizona. Look at growth rate for Texas. Dakota's growing at 4%. What the fuck?
Okay, so
West Virginia is declining at 10%. All these other states are high. No. Why would you ask that question? That is almost as bad as the Kennedy question. Would you ever want to? All right. Yeah, right. I can be senator. It's my turn. All right, let me get you guys. Yeah, exactly. All these votes. Governor. Why? Why are people moving to the south and to the southwest and the west coast? Why? Go ahead. Because they can is a huge part of it.
We were saying because the freeways allow them to, and also because of weather conditions.
Weather's a huge part of it. People are leaving the parts of America that suck in the winter. And they're moving to where it's warmer, where it's warmer. Has anybody ever been moving to the south in American history? No. But now we're starting to see businesses, this is an important thing for the next 50 years of American history, businesses are starting to open up in southern states. Because southern states have less taxation. Because they're more conservative, states' rightsy types of approach. They've always believed in less government intervention. That's not new. But now that becomes attractive for businesses post-World War II. Weather, labor force, and all those states that pass laws that are against labor unions, there they are. So businesses can move here, not worry about labor unions, still pay their workers a terrible wage, and have good weather for production all year long. Go figure. Also here, also here, also here. So we start to see our population start to diffuse itself in America. Right? For the most part, up to this point in American history, everybody lives under my hand. All right, and we're starting to see American population diffuse itself southward, southwestward, and westward. If I showed you a population, I went to the presidential election maps, and like, oh, California only has like 12 votes? Yeah, because nobody lives there yet. Right? It's World War II and the post-World War II world that really starts making the West Coast a destination type of place. So understand here that less taxes is important, and favorable ownership laws, not labor laws. Here, weather, opportunity, land, space, etc. So this leads to what we call the 1950s an age of affluence. Affluence just means wealth and happiness, right? And it's caused by a couple things. Right? We have a post-war economic boom that's caused by a few things. Thing one, a desire for consumer goods. When's the last time America was really buying consumer goods? Yeah, the 20s, right? We got the radios, right? The cars, they're having a good time. But this desire for goods is very suppressed or put down in the 30s and 40s. Question for you guys. Why is it suppressed in the 30s? Great Depression, right? Everybody broke as hell. Why is it suppressed in the 40s? World War II, right? Rationing, and the fact that if you have extra money, what are you spending it on? War bonds. We see a ton of government spending during the Cold War, which puts more money in people's pockets because they're hiring people, they're spending a bunch of money on military production, on highway construction, all this stuff. That puts money in people's pockets. And it's also really fueled by this baby boom. I'll talk about this in a couple slides. But everybody in America is having babies. For the first time in American history, birth rate actually declines during the Great Depression. It starts to peak back up into the 1940s and World War II. And in the 1950s, everybody has a baby. A British observer comes to visit America in the late 40s, early 50s, and he's quoted as saying, "Every housewife I see is pregnant." Like, everybody's just pregnant, man. Everybody's having babies. But when people have babies, they move to the suburbs. When you move to a suburb, that increases the demand for housing. That increases the demand for consumer goods, for cribs, for cars, for all this stuff. So all together, we have all these reasons for a big post-war economic boom. All right, some of the stuff we're buying, record players. All right, record players became a big deal in the 1950s. Cars with automatic transmissions, So you don't have to stick shift your way from first gear to second gear to third gear to fourth gear. Makes driving more convenient, right? It's like the stoves in the 1920s. How much easier your life could be. TVs. TV is to the 50s what radio is to the 20s. I cannot stress that to you guys enough. Right? So much of our mass culture disseminates itself in the 20s through radio. By the 50s, it's happening through TV. New filtered cigarettes are very popular in the 1950s. So everybody and their mom got lung cancer today. So more convenient, seen as like classier versions of cigarettes, and new refrigerators that make domestic life much, much easier. But I want to stress this to you guys really heavily now, and I wanted to stick with you. That this affluence, all this extra money, is going to lead us directly into conformity. When everybody's buying the same car, everybody's buying the same clothes, everybody's buying the same TV, everybody's looking at the exact same advertisements on TV. The 1950s becomes a very affluent time, but if there's one word to attach to this decade, I need you to understand this is a decade of conformity. Everybody's conforming to what they think society wants them to look like. Now, there's a variety of factors that will lead to that, and I'll talk about all of them. But if we just start attaching that word conformity to the 50s, like you guys attach conformity to the 20s, it will make your life easier. There's a reason that everybody breaks out of their box and gets all crazy and smokes a bunch of weed in the 1960s. Because anytime you try to pack society into a nice, neat little box, that will then lead the next generation to breaking out of that box. Always. Why did I go to college and go wild? Because my parents had to raise me to be a very conformist type of individual. And I got to college and I was like, what? This is amazing. Never mind. So it's helpful to understand that if we all have the same car, and we all have the same record player, and we all have the same TV, and we're all wearing the same outfit to work, how affluent are we really? Or are we just trying to live up to this norm of society, that what society wants us to look like? Right? All this spending is really fueled by the Marshall Plan and the Korean War. Spend, 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 spend. But what we see, which is crazy to think about, in just one generation, we transform ourselves from crippling depression of the 1930s, 25% unemployment rate, savings accounts lost, no money, to the highest standard of living in the world, kind of by far, in one generation. We go from abject poverty, people thinking that maybe this depression is never going to end, to the richest country in the world by a lot within 18 to 20 years. Which is kind of crazy. It is kind of crazy. Yeah, in one lifetime, right? There's people that lived through the 20s, lived through the Great Depression, lived through World War II, and then got to see the 50s and the other way out. And they're only 45 years old. Think about it, right? Like, we've been talking about all this American history. We're only 30 years removed from the flappers. We've been diving so deeply into these conversations that no time has really passed. Right? We're just 30 years removed from Prohibition. We're just 25 years removed from Hoover telling us that poverty's almost gone. We're just 20 years removed from Hoover locking himself in a closet scared because the bonus army's going to come get him. Right? Not that much time has passed, but think how much has happened. Right? That's why I say that the two most monumental events in American history post-Civil War are the Great Depression, New Deal, and World War II. And here we are on the back end of that. So it's important that we understand that TV is the big driver of culture in the 1950s. Look at these TVs. Fantastic. I think I had this TV growing up. My mother, I don't know, my dad has. My mom to this day still has like an old school TV that's like deeper than it is wide. Yeah, it's a real thing. Right. Yeah, it's like antebellum Lynch thing. Now, TV in the 1950s becomes the big transmitter of culture, of society, of expectations. Right? We see often very famous TV shows that you probably may have heard of today, like I Love Lucy, very famous show. The Milton Berle show. As TV really begins to replace radio, replace print reading as the big conveyor of American consumer culture. Right? So TV's where we're going to get our... I showed you guys those print ads in the 1920s for like stoves and whatnot. Right? We're not going to get print ads as much anymore, but now it's commercials on TV. So in these TV shows, we're going to even see in these shows this message of conformity. Right? It's a mom, it's a dad, they live in a suburb, they got 3 kids. Right? The dad wears the same suit to work every day. He comes home, dinner's on the stove. Life is good. Comes home, puts his feet up, reads his newspaper. Right? It's very, even in our TV shows, a very conformist type message. Right? And a lot of that is fueled by what becomes known as the baby boom. So this is birth rate. Births per 1,000 women aged 15 to 44. As you can see, yeah, guys, get started. 1940s, we'll see our birth rate tick up during World War II, tick down, and then look what happens to it. For the entirety of the 50s, we're literally just having babies. Yeah, real lit. Right. Until you got 6 babies under the age of 6 running around. You're like, what just happened? I got basketball team +1. By the mid to late 1950s, everybody in America has been having babies, right? So this late 40s and 1950s time is called the baby boom. Why? Because like most things in APUSH, they're very appropriately titled. There was a boom in babies. There we go. The baby boom in the late 40s and 1950s. But all of this together, right? The affluence, the babies, and the conformity. I want all 3 of those to play a role in our conversation. The affluence, the babies, and the conformity, the desire to do what everybody else is doing, is going to lead us directly into what's called suburbia. Into suburban America. America makes this full transition from an urban or rural living country to a largely suburban living country. Hector, was it last year that you guys had the little boxes on the test? Yeah, exactly. And I played this on in class. Anybody watch the show Weeds? Anybody back in the day? All right. What's the song that kicks off Weeds? Remember the song Luis? I've heard of that book.
I know exactly.
Tell me. If you can't know exactly, and then tell me you don't know.
I don't know how.
Little boxes. So watch Weeds. It's a good show. So as America moves to the suburbs, it's going to very, very significantly change America's way of life. In the suburbs, we're going to see blue-collar and white-collar workers living in the same place. Right? Workers that do manual labor, right? Work in a factory, use your hands, produce something, and workers that are considered white collars, like management types. Right? Because in America in the 50s, blue-collar work and white-collar work could get you into the middle class. Right? These suburban neighborhoods are middle-class defined. That you could do manual work, you could work in a factory, you could do something else with your hands, you could be a mechanic, that's blue-collar work. You could be a plumber, blue-collar work, or you could be the manager of some office, some accountant office, white-collar work, and still afford to live in the same neighborhood. Now, as we have our suburbs branch out from our cities, what does that rely on? Cars, roads, grocery stores. So these suburbs are going to depend on expansion of other parts, which is also going to fuel the American economy. Right? Car buying. Building of new grocery stores. This is when we first start to really see the idea of shopping malls. I know, it's exciting. Shopping malls. Ladies. No way. So as we expand our society, we're not just expanding residential living, we're also expanding what comes with it. Right now, every suburb, who's ever been to a place, that's a good suburb for LA. What's a good example? Pasadena is a good example. Pasadena is almost like its own urban area now because it's so big. Bell Gardens, yeah, not wrong. Gardena, sure. Any of these like cities are still kind of big cities, but outside of LA, what does every one of them have? Malls, movie theaters, car dealerships. Yeah, Suburban America. That you're not. Yeah, but there's cities that are outside of bigger cities, like smaller cities that are outside of bigger cities. So, suburbs really allow for the idea of nuclear family living. That you live in a house, you live there, your husband, your wife lives there, your 3 kids live there, and that's it. But who's moving to these suburban areas is largely white people. So this becomes this really important development in American history. I'd argue it's probably not that important for the AP curriculum, but it's important for life, of white flight. Well, when did we first start seeing white flight, though?
Back in
Because I talked about it in class.
it was.
I even showed you a map of Chicago.
Yeah, it was during like the
Yeah, so part of like the Great Migration, World War I, but also because of like the Gilded Age, industrial capacity, and transportation. Once you have like the rail cars and people could move farther away from the cities, then the ownership class begins moving out of cities. With the 1950s, they're going to move even farther out of cities. Because now you don't need a train, you don't need a trolley car, you just have your own car. So white flight to the suburbs is going to make the suburbs really, really white, and the urban areas left behind really, really black. So this white flight leaves behind largely black urban cores. I tell you this because this is going to make a really big difference, for example, in the Watts riots, in the Memphis riots, in the Detroit riots, where black people who were left behind by society are then being blamed for being poor when society left them behind, and it leads to a ton of racial tension and problems. So this rapid growth of suburban life is going to lead to even more conformity. There's a good phrase from the 1950s that I'll put on the board here, and it's that conformity breeds conformity. It's self-perpetuating. That as people move to the suburbs to be conformist, it leads them to do then more conformist type things like everybody else is doing. So in the 1950s, we see a couple important things. One, very importantly, a huge increase in church membership. Way more Americans go to church in the 1950s than the 20s, 30s, and 40s. This is one way in which the 50s are different than the 20s. Religious preference becomes the primary identifying feature of the suburbs. You are picking a suburb based on what church is there. Is it a Baptist church? Is it a Presbyterian church? Is it a Congregational church? Is it you see what I'm saying? Is it a Methodist church? So people are moving to suburbs based on the religious makeup of that suburb. So we're even seeing more conformity. Then they're all going to church together. They're all going to school together. Everybody's like freaking robots. Please don't underestimate how big of a characteristic of this religious increase as a result of the Second Red Scare. Right? In the Second Red Scare, we look at the communists as the bad guys. They're the bad guys. They're the evildoers. We are the good Christian Americans. We are the good Christian Americans. We see public schools growing because each of these suburbs is going to have a bunch of kids, the baby boom, who need to go to school. So the idea of suburb education leads to a huge growth of schools and eventually becomes a huge goal of college education for all of these kids as they grow up. So we can trace this. They're called the baby boom generation. They're still around today. They're messing up every part of life, I promise. It's a good Thursday conversation about how the baby boom is screwing up America, because they won't die. But the baby boom, we watch schools boom in the 1960s, because they're now becoming 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. And then watching colleges boom later as this older generation keeps moving up through life. So now, right now, we're seeing retirement homes boom. Because this baby boom that was born in the 1950s is now 65, 70 years old, retiring. It is old, you're right. You're right. And a lot of them are still in better shape than our old days. Now, what this leads to, though, is this post-war America in which everybody wants to live in a suburb and look and dress and sound the exact same way. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention the role of all of this, of what's called the GI Bill, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, plays a huge role in this. As all these soldiers from World War II, all these soldiers are being given access to home loans, access to free college, access to educational and financial opportunities, which allows the World War II generation to be very successful in readjusting to life in a way the World War I generation never was. The lost generation. So we learn our lessons from World War I, and we see to it that World War II's veterans have a much smoother transition back into a successful rise of economic America. It's fueled by the baby boom, which fuels suburban growth, which then fuels this rise of the Sun Belt that I talked to you about. As people are moving to places like the Southwest, like the southeastern coast of the United States, like California. So take a look at this. This is an example of suburb living. But just imagine for a second that every one of these houses looks the same. Every one of these houses is painted the same. Every one of these houses is built by the same company. It is creepy. It's very creepy. There's reports of people like going home and being unable to find their house. Right? As people move to the suburbs and they go home and because all the streets look the same, all the houses look the same. Like, it was terrible. Not even kidding. Yes, sir.
Sorry to interrupt. Christoph has a doctor's appointment.
Yeah, he does.
Yes,
Yeah, he does. Cool. Bye, Christoph. So, but look at this conformity, though. Look at this conformity and this idea that everybody looks the same. And it doesn't help that everybody has the exact same car in their driveway. So we see this growth of the suburbs, and I have some data to prove it. It's very much like Twilight Zone. Yeah, there's a Twilight Zone episode on that. We see from 1940 to 1960, our suburban dwellers, the people in America who live in suburbs, go from 20% to 30%. And they're moving there not necessarily from big cities, but from rural and small town areas. So it's important that you guys understand that the 50s are a time of suburbia, a time of conformity, a time of the baby boom, etc. And this is what gives us this idea of conformity and conservatism in the 1950s. Right? The U.S. goes from being a very liberal-leaning, moving country, spending-wise and everything, expression-wise in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, to conservatism in the 1950s. I'll give you some data. It's caused by a couple things: New Deal politics, we're tired of spending money on everybody, Cold War, the baby boom in suburbia. But in the 1950s, we're going to really reassert our social norms. Our social norms. Women, what do women do during World War II? Yeah, they fill in, they make a ton of progress. Rosie the Riveter. Women go right back in the 50s to doing exactly what they wanted to do before the war. Traditional housewife, cook, clean, make your husband happy. Short term, don't worry, we're going to get pissed in a little bit. But women, this is not that society forces them back. Women choose to go back to the house where they think that their norm belongs, where their sphere belongs, and they're going to be happier there. So the 1950s is all about dad goes off to work in an office, Mom is there waiting, takes care of the kids, takes care of the cooking, takes care of the house. Very traditional gender roles. The 1950s is all about respect for authority. That we should respect those who tell us what to do, respect the religious authority, respect political authority. And the 1950s is very against, I'll get there in a second. The 1950s are very against drugs, against perversion, against weird stuff. But keep in mind that all of this comes in the context of the Cold War. We think this is what makes America great. Right? That we respect authority. We respect women and men in their separate spheres. We don't do drugs. We don't do terrible things. We don't do things like oh no, gay people? Not in the 1950s. Oh my God, you tried to date a Mexican? Not in the 1950s. So 1950s American, you tried to date a gay Mexican? What? So 1950s America, 1950s America is very conformist. Yeah. In this time of conservatism, this time of the Cold War, and look at it. Church membership goes from half of America to 70% of America. Church membership skyrockets. And two things are added to our common vernacular, our common discourse. One nation under God is added to our Pledge of Allegiance. Was not there before. And in God we trust was added to our money. Was not there before. Not until the 1950s. So we look at this perfect storm of anti-communism, of pro-authority, of conformity, and then there we see 1954 we had under God to our Pledge of Allegiance. 1956 we had in God we trust as our national motto, and it's on our money. There's another. This is kind of like almost like a fourth Great Awakening, if you will. In a way that we even have a famous preacher and everything. Billy Graham is his name. There he is. And his big goal is to pursue a form of pure evangelism. That we look at our TV. Sleeping in separate beds. Yeah. So all of this defined conservatism and conformity is not without critics. It's not without critics. Some are going to be very critical of what they see as fake America. I would argue they're definitely not wrong. There's two famous authors that are very critical of America's conformity to social pressures, of trying to buy the same thing and look the same and act the same and sound the same and drive the same car. William White publishes The Organized Man, and David Reisman publishes Lonely Crowd. The names of the books aren't necessarily important, just that we see this emerging criticism of conformity, which I think is very healthy in society. A much more important movement, though, are the beatniks, because they're going to grow up to be the hippies next generation. They're the roots of the hippies. The beatniks, or the beat generation, are going to be this new, what's called a counterculture, against mainstream culture. We also refer to the hippies as the counterculture. Hector? Yeah. And this group is going to start to push back on the conformity of the 1950s. They're going to dress differently. They're going to act differently. They're going to speak differently. They're going to present themselves differently. Who's ever read The Outsiders? Yeah, the Greasers. The Greasers are largely modeled off of the B generation of the 1950s. All right, doing things their own way, pushing back on conformity. Whereas the Socials are this stereotype of mainstream conformity 1950s culture. It's this group, this B generation, that's going to give rise to the counterculture revolutionaries of the anti-war movements, flower power movement, the environmental conservation movement, the let's do a bunch of LSD and smoke a bunch of weed movement of the 1960s. But they're inspired by Zen Buddhism and Michael Bush. And this idea, though, of finding your happiness in inner peace. Finding your happiness internally. Just like transcendentalists. Push back on what society wants from you and find your peace internally. I want to ask the question, you beat me to it. I'm mad, but I'm too happy to be mad. So that's life in the 1950s, right? We see these are the four things we should know. Suburban growth, because of population, because of highways, because of demand for goods. Our politics, very prosperous. but we're kind of worried and scared about the Cold War with a lot of fear and anxiety. We solve this fear and anxiety by just trying to buy more stuff. Popular culture, we have the growth of rock and roll. Elvis becomes a thing in the 1950s, and all these women are like, oh my God, no. He's up there gyrating his hips. My kids can't see that. But we still see this beat movement rejecting conformity while TV reinforces conformity. Do the same thing, buy the same thing. And then, of course, it's important, I'll talk about this more so on Monday, but this unequal representation idea. That our urban areas are going to fall into disrepair because all the money leaves urban areas and goes to suburbs. Minorities are going to still be experiencing a ton of discrimination and prejudice. But we start in the 1950s starting to see these organizations to fight for civil rights. The NAACP plays a large role. CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, which I talked about during World War II, pushing for black rights as well. Now there's two more, another group of critics that I want to identify as fit that question, then I'll let you read for a second. William White, I told you guys, he writes this organization Man, which makes fun of America for all wearing the same suit to work every day. There's a quote in the book that's pretty good. The guy says, like, yeah, I can wear whatever I wanted to work as long as it has a white shirt with a black tie. That's how people just wore the same thing to work. They're dressing. Just eat the freaking Cheetos. But two other really important books that I want you to identify as. Go stand in the hallway. Go now. That was something a 9-year-old would do in my classroom. Kelly Oubre would have made that shot. Two books that I want you to identify as like the new muckrakers. The new muckrakers of the progressive era. John Kenneth Galbraith, he writes The Affluent Society. Very important book because it's going to impact a hell of a lot of JFK's policy. And he says that, like, cool, we're all affluent, but what have we done to better society? Well, we all have money, but we're doing nothing to help the common good. We're all only looking out for ourselves, and we're doing nothing to fix the social differences in America. Cool, we have a lot of money. What have we done with it that's anything positive? And the second book is what we're going to read a chunk of in a second from Michael Harrington, titled The Other America. And when I asked you guys read a chunk of this in your homework, it's very much like what book? Progress and Poverty, no, we're close. How the Other Half Lives. Yeah. Progress and Poverty is either one I'll be happy with. Very much Henry George's Progress and Poverty, Jacob Riis, How the Other Half Lives. And it's very much like Gilded Age-esque. Of how come we're all so rich and happy and buying stuff, but in his case, he's going to highlight rural poverty as well. Inner city poverty like Riis does, but he's going to point out a ton of rural poverty as well. People are just really poor in rural areas without electricity, without access to progress, and it makes things really rough. Right. The quote that you'll read, the entire invisible land of the other America, very much how the other half lived, became a ghetto. A modern poor farm for the rejects of society and the rejects of the economy. It's from this point going forward that the poorest areas of America are in rural, undeveloped places. Today in America, the poorest place isn't what we consider urban or ghetto cities. It's rural West Virginia, rural Kentucky. Places like this, 1946, in which we see rural white America being left behind by an advancing consumerist middle-class suburbia America, in pictures that are like this, which are very influential to this idea of the other America. So again, very much like how the other half lives. So I'm going to give you about 5 minutes to dive into Michael Harrington, The Other America. I'll give you 5 to skim through it real quick. I got 3 questions for you. I already answered the third one. My bad. I got ahead of myself. I got excited. We'll go ahead and read it. What does he blame for the poverty in America? And what does he blame for the lack of attention to poverty? So why is there poverty, and why aren't we paying attention, in his words? Okay? Take 5. Read it. I'll let you talk about it afterwards, and then we will go from there. Good job in the first half of today. Yes. Bathroom? Make sure you take a pass. Skinny or what? Big guys save lives. All right. Read. 4 minutes. Good job. The text. Let's get into Eisenhower's Cold War. Where does this poverty come from in his mind? And why are we paying attention to it? It's a good text. We're so busy entertaining ourselves that we're like neglecting the fact that there's always problems in society. But we're so busy pursuing like conformity and watching TV. Nice synthesis to today, I can make an argument. Social media. All right. If you're not quite done, no big deal. But I think you've got the general gist of what he's trying to get at. It's a good text. I think it's a very powerful book because it does for America, and hopefully does for America, what books like How the Other Half and Progress of Poverty does and exposes America to problems. So take a minute with your partner, please, and just identify his general thesis. What does he argue about where this poverty comes from and why America is ignoring that poverty? Take a minute and dive in, and then I'll get into Eisenhower's Cold War. Go. 1 minute. Chop, chop. Go for it. You putting your head down to sleep, or you putting your head down to look at paper? What? Get a towel on the neck. Bah! It's crap that your mom's when you got a hand and she get mad at you too. I'll see it. It's a lose-lose situation, bro. It's a no. It's a slippery slope. It's a no-win. conformity, right? If we all make ourselves believe that we're all the same, and we're all doing well, we can ignore what's happening.
You also notice
What does he say?
or that way
But is he saying that, or is he saying society is saying that? Read it. Here is the most familiar version of social blindness. Yeah, good. Really good point. All right, let's get up here. That was a good, exhaustive first hour 10, so thank you for bearing with me, as I had a lot to say. But you seem moderately entertained. Chavez, what's going on in the other America, according to our friend here, Michael Harrington?
They're well, the middle class are like deciding to ignore and isolate themselves from the
Yeah, we're seeing the middle class choosing to ignore and isolate themselves. Almost like this suburbia becomes a convenient excuse to create your own bubble, in which everybody around you looks like you, sounds like you, has money like you, drives a car like you, has a job like you. And when I look, our community is so diverse. We got blue-collar workers and white-collar workers. But you still just got blue or white-collar, middle-class white people. When your kids are going to the same school, you can ignore these problems. Josue, why are we okay ignoring these problems? Or why are we ignoring these problems, sir?
because we're too much, or we're involved in entertainment, and we're watching TV, we're conforming to what society wants us to do.
Good. Kat, build on that, please.
I was going to just say that we're so focused on the entertainment that they're ignoring all the problems.
Yeah. The line I like a lot says that this new segregation of poverty. It's a new kind of segregation in America. It's not black and white necessarily, but this new segregation of poverty is compounded by a well-meaning ignorance. We are ignorant about it, but we're not being ignorant on purpose. Nobody's choosing to ignore these people. It's a well-meaning ignorance. A good many concerned and good humans, good Americans are aware there is much discussion over renewal, and they drive through a city and they see things being rebuilt, like, oh, look, it's all getting better, not realizing what's happening underneath. It's very Gilded Age esque. The line I wanted to point out, too, Josue referenced at the very end. Here is the most familiar version of social blindness. Of social blindness. The poor are that way because they are afraid of work. Anyway, they all have big cars. If they were like me or my father or my grandfather, they could pay their own way. But they prefer to live on the dole and cheat the taxpayers. Is that what he is saying, or is that what he's saying society is saying? Yeah, right? So these three up here reference social Darwinism. That is very much, and we see this reference in society today. Oh, poor people are poor because of their own damn fault. They want to just take taxpayers' money, take food stamps, but then why do they have nice phones? Why do they have nice cars? Using food stamps. All right, it's a very similar argument that society makes today as they're making in the 1950s. So all this conformity is important, all this affluence is important, but this idea of what's happening in the other America, this new economic-based segregation is also important, very, very important as well. And that'll play a big role in the chaos of the 1960s. That when you try to put society in these nice, neat little boxes, it does not last forever. All right, let's transition then from domestic policy to foreign policy and talk about Eisenhower's Cold War. Now, his Cold War is titled by one word, his policy. Brinksmanship. Brinksmanship is the title of his strategy, his policy. What does it mean to push somebody to the brink? Right to the edge, and that's what he's going to do. That's brinksmanship. He's going to say, check this out. I am right here on the edge of this cliff. If you push me off this cliff, we're going to have atomic war. How hard do you want to push? Any takers? And that's Eisenhower's approach to the Cold War, is if I get the United States right here to this edge, nobody wants to push me, nobody wants to try me, nobody wants to attempt anything, because they know that I'm this close to the edge. All it would take is one little push, and we're gone. So he's actually very well prepared to be the Cold War president. He's very well prepared because of World War II. Foreign policy is his expertise. He's been a general for a long, long time. And he has two real goals. Two real goals for foreign policy. First, take a strong stand against communism with what's called massive retaliation. That's brinksmanship. Massive retaliation. If you push me a little bit, I'll drop 16 atomic bombs on your country. Oh, all right. Never mind, bro. Never mind. And he starts using covert CIA operations instead of normalized formal military offensive. And he wants to then reduce defense spending. Here it is, economically conservative again. Spend less on the military. And then reduce Cold War tension. Which I don't know how this makes sense. It doesn't seem to make much sense. How would you have a bunch of atomic bombs and then spend less money? He wants to spend a bunch less money on conventional things. He's like, why do we need a big army? Why do we need tanks? Why do we need guns? Why do we need any of that stuff? All we need is planes and bombs, baby. Why do I need a conventional army if I could just fly a plane over your country and drop a nuke on it? So he's going to cut spending on the traditional military stuff, like having a big army, like tanks, like trucks, all that stuff, and instead just have a bunch of atomic weapons, and that's about it. There he is. He's a good dude. Good head of hair on him. He has a ton of World War II military experience in both the European theater, D-Day. D-Day is him, as well as Asia after Germany quits. He's very pragmatic, very sensible, very calm, very well organized. And he's a very good politician and a very good diplomat, very good at negotiation. As his Secretary of State is a very important name, whose name we should reference in Cold War because it'll pop up on a document or something, I promise. John Foster Dulles, who's also very hard line. Our way or the highway. Don't push us. Don't push us. This is what we're demanding. This is what we expect. So unlike Truman's administration, where we're going to see a bunch of action on the Cold War, under Eisenhower's, this approach of being really aggressive with what you're threatening is pretty successful. It works with China in the Korean War. China backs down. We have our armistice. It's going to work a couple other places as well. So his massive retaliation idea, spending-wise, is basically just more bang for the buck. Whatever you're going to spend, you should get more out of that spending. Right? It says that if we have nuclear weapons and long-range missiles, that's way cheaper than paying a bunch of people in the army. We don't need to have conventional armed forces. If we can just sit right here in America, push a button, and bomb somebody. It's pretty legit. Right? Why would we send a 15,000-person army if one plane could do the job? Right? And this massive retaliation strategy, his thinking is that the more bombs we have, the less likely we'll have to use them. Speak softly, carry a big stick. Very big stick diplomacy-esque, right? The more forces that I have, the less likely I'll need to actually use them. But the problem with this idea of massive retaliation is you have no middle ground. You have no alternative, right? There's no intermediate course of action. You can either negotiate or you can knock a country off the face of the earth. Yeah, mutually assured destruction. So the problem becomes with this is there's no gray area, there's no middle ground, right? At what point is somebody pushing you enough to justify wiping their country off of the earth? Without a middle ground in between, we're kind of stuck with option one is have a negotiation. If the negotiation fails, then end them. There's no logical in between. As we see massive retaliation, by being able to retaliate so massively, that means you're immediately going to target civilian targets, not military targets. So this is going to ideally keep the Soviet Union from doing anything out of the ordinary, or we'll just, up and end them. And Ike is going to rely very heavily on this idea of brinksmanship. He's going to use veiled, sneaky threats of nuclear war. Like, if you don't agree with us, I would hate to see what happened to you. To try to then avoid nuclear war. To accomplish his goals. I don't know, bro. Ike's going to rely very heavily on this idea that if I threaten things, I'm not going to actually follow through on those threats. So let's talk about a couple of things that he actually does on foreign policy. One is China. China is trying to expand themselves further into some islands near Taiwan. And Eisenhower literally calls China on the phone. And is like, hey, if you take those islands, I'm going to nuke you. And China's like, damn, this guy is wild as hell. This is now the second time he's threatened to nuke China. First time was over Korea. China's like, you know what? We're not going to push him. We're not going to push him. And China backs off. Eisenhower is hoping that if we threaten China, hear this out for a second, guys. If we threaten China, who should come to their defense? The Soviet Union, right? Is the Soviet Union going to? No, in Eisenhower's mind, because they don't want none either. So he's hoping that if we threaten China and the Soviet Union does not come to their defense, then we're going to drive a wedge between the Soviet Union and China as these two big communist countries. Very much so. Very much so. Right? China does not know if he's bluffing or not. They don't know if he's kidding or not, so they're like, all right, cool, never mind. We don't want those islands that bad anyway. You can have them. And the USSR refuses to aid China in this situation, and that does begin to divide these two great, it's a very good idea. It begins to divide these two great communist powers to not operate together, but operate instead isolated from each other. China gets a little buttered about this. They do. They do. We also see this policy taking effect in the Middle East, specifically in Egypt. Now, in Egypt in 1956, Egypt is where we get a lot of what? Oil. Egypt is where we get a lot of oil. Now, the Egyptian leader Nasser, this is more of a world history thing, but he's going to nationalize or have his country take over for their own profit the Suez Canal, which is the big overwater access point to the entire Middle East. Right? The geography is not that important, but access to this canal is like access to the Panama Canal from the Western Hemisphere, access to the Erie Canal in New York in the Market Revolution time, where you need to use this canal to facilitate everything else that happens. Egypt takes it over. They nationalize it, so their country is going to run the canal for their own profit. England and France get really mad, because England and France have always had access to this themselves. They've always played a way bigger role in the Middle East than we have. So England and France invade Egypt to take back the canal. The USSR is mad. The Soviet Union is going to fight England and France. It turns into a hot-ass mess. It's all sorts of terrible. So what we see instead, though, is America doesn't side with either group. The U.S. Threatens the USSR to back off and say, if you don't back off, we're going to nuclear bomb you. England and France are threatened by the U.S., and the U.S. says, if you guys don't get out of Egypt, we'll cut off the aid to you guys. So we'll cut off all Marshall Plan aid to you. We're not going to bomb you because you're our friends or whatnot. But we'll cut off all your money. And the U.S. then instead steps in. This is very important for what happens later. The U.S. gets the USSR out by threatening to bomb them, gets England and France out by threatening to cut off their money, and the U.S. steps in and deals with the problem, and thus becomes the police force in the Middle East. England and France and the USSR all leave Egypt. The U.S. becomes the chief Western voice in the Middle East. And that is one of the things that's going to lead to all sorts of things like terrorism today, hatred of America in the Middle East today, chaos in Iran today, as the U.S. then fills this void when England and France back off as this Western or European presence in the Middle East over oil. Eisenhower says, if those fellows start something, we may have to hit them, and if necessary, we'll hit them with everything in the bucket. Eisenhower threatens to literally drop every atomic bomb we have on the USSR. But then that leaves us in a place of leadership in the Middle East that I don't necessarily think was maybe such a good idea. But what this big picture, what happens with the Suez crisis, is the Middle East is very vulnerable. This is why. The Middle East is very vulnerable to communism. Take 30 seconds to talk to your partner why. Why is the Middle East a very vulnerable place to communism? Go for it. Go for it. That's part of it, good.
What?
So yeah, it's huge. That's part of it. 5 seconds. 3, 2, 1. All right, let's talk about why. Why is the Middle East so, what's the word I used? Vulnerable to communism. First one, Brenda, go. Good. Geographically, I heard that as well. Like, proximity-wise, they're very close. Why else?
You said they had dictators, so dictators, they're supposed to
Some. not all have dictators. Go ahead.
Domino effect.
Domino effect, absolutely. What aren't they? They're not developed. They're not rich. They're third world countries from not like undeveloped third world like we use today, but Cold War third world, because they were all colonies. So because they were all colonies, they don't have stable societies put in place, and that makes them more vulnerable thanks to decolonization. Thanks to the fact that they all have valuable resources like oil without any sort of stable structure in place that would make it more logistically challenging for communists to take over. So this makes us realize, this Suez crisis makes us realize that, damn, the Middle East is very vulnerable to communism. We can't have that happen. You know why? Because the Middle East has oil. And now the U.S. is a more vehicle-driven country. The fact that for our Cold War foreign policy, we need oil for all of our tanks, for our planes, for everything. The U.S. needs oil. The U.S. used to have enough oil for itself, but now we need more oil, hence the Middle East. So if we need more oil, and most of that oil is in the Middle East, can we afford for the Middle East to go communist? No. And there's the legacy of the 20th century and American foreign policy today. So what we do in 1957 is we publish create the Eisenhower Doctrine. And I'll tell you what it is the exact same thing as the Truman Doctrine, but to the Middle East. The Truman Doctrine applies to Greece and Turkey. The Eisenhower Doctrine takes that same idea of any nation that is fighting against the spread of communism will give them whatever they need to the Middle East. And what do we do? 1957, 1 year later, Eisenhower sends U.S. forces to Lebanon. To Lebanon in the Middle East. And stops communism from expanding. And the U.S. military helps install a government that is very pro-West. Very pro-America. And here we are, now for the first time, using our military forces to put in place a government that's friendly to us. Good idea, bad idea? What do you guys think? Controversial idea. What's good about it? It's not communist. What's bad about it?